Hello, this one is going to be about non-restrictive adjective clauses. Now this is something you're probably not going to have in your English classes. Used to we taught it all the time, but as you well know, grammar seems to have been taking a back seat in our classes. So it's very easy and it'll go very quickly. So here we go. When we talk about non-restrictive adjective clauses, we are simply talking about clauses that are not necessary. So when you see this word non-restrictive, I want you to think instead not necessary. And then you ask the question, not necessary for what? Well, not necessary for identification purposes. So we've just learned about appositives, and we saw that those can be restrictive and non-restrictive. Adjective clauses can also be restrictive or non-restrictive, otherwise known as necessary or not necessary. But we still want to look at these terms and be sure you understand what it is. When a phrase or clause is necessary to identify the thing you're talking about, the phrase is essential. It's necessary, otherwise known as restrictive. This is the important thing. It's necessary to identify the thing you're talking about. Okay, it's essential to the meaning, essential for definition. Essential phrases and clauses do not take commas. They are necessary for identification. And remember, when you put commas around something, you're basically telling your reader you really don't have to have that. So if the information is not necessary for identification, then we're going to need to set that information off from the basic sentence by commas. When the clause is not necessary, we call it non-essential, non-restrictive. I like to call it not necessary, so that we've got the not, the non, and the non, and they can't get confused that way. We're going to talk more about this as we move forward, but first we need to be sure that you can identify and create adjective clauses. So let's start there. An adjective clause is a subordinate clause, which is a dependent clause, but it functions as an adjective. It generally is going to begin with relative pronouns, who, whose, whom, which, and that. And just like all adjectives, it generally sits very close to the word it modifies. Because it functions as an adjective, the adjective clause can be removed from the sentence, and you'll still have a complete sentence. Here's our example. Where is the book that you have already read? Well, clearly, here is our adjective clause that you have already read, and it does modify book. So let's look at the criteria. It functions as an adjective. It modifies a noun, which of course is book. It begins with a relative pronoun. Here are your relative pronouns that begin adjective clauses, who, whose, whom, which, and that. There we are with the that. It sits next to the word that it modifies. Here's your whole clause. It sits next to the word that it's describing or identifying. And you can take that clause out of the sentence and still have a sentence. So if I took this thing all out, I would still have my sentence. Where is the book? So those are the criteria for identifying adjective clauses, and it all passes there. Now I want you to try to create some on your own. You're going to start off just like I've got here. I saw the man who, and you get to fill in anything that you want here. On your answer choices, I might have some suggestions, but basically it can be anything. I saw the man who spoke to my dad. Whatever you want to put here. I just want you to get in the habit of writing adjective clauses so that you'll recognize them. Remember, they start with who, whom, whose, which, and that. Get used to those. That's going to help you to identify them. Then we're going to move on, and we're going to see if we can create sentences that have adjective clauses, and we're going to do that from two smaller sentences. So we've got the dog ran behind the car, he barked wildly. And I'm going to create one long sentence, but it's going to have an adjective clause in it. So I could say the dog that barked wildly ran behind the car. Or I could say the dog that ran behind the car barked wildly. So here's my adjective clause that barked wildly. If I take it out, I still have a sentence. The dog ran behind the car. Here's my adjective clause in this sentence, that ran behind the car. If I take it out, I still have a sentence. The dog barked wildly. So that's one way that you can be sure that you're looking at an adjective clause, aside from the fact that it must begin with a relative pronoun, who, whose, whom, which, or that. And you can sometimes begin them with these adverbs, where and when. So when you're writing sentences, you might experiment and see if you can figure out how to do that. I do want you to note, all these sentences will contain restrictive adjective clauses. You will not have to worry about putting commas into these particular sentences. That's going to come a little bit later. All I want you to do right now is to combine these two short sentences into a longer, much more sophisticated sentence by using an adjective clause. Now we're going to learn to decide whether or not an adjective clause actually does require a set of commas around it. Remember the rules. If the adjective clause is necessary for identification purposes, you do not put commas around it. That means it would be an essential restrictive clause. Restrictive clauses begin with relative pronouns, who, whose, whom, which, and that. Here's the next one, the opposite of that. If the adjective clause is not necessary for identification, it's set off from the rest of the sentence with commas, because we use those commas to say, well, this information might be interesting, but it is not actually essential to identify who I'm talking about. Notice this, the clauses that begin with the word which are generally non-restrictive. So just as a rule of thumb, anytime you see a clause that starts with the word which, you're pretty safe to put a comma right before it. So here's two examples. The man who gave the award is my math teacher. Let's say that this man is standing up on the stage and there are 6 other men up there. If I do not know this part, who gave the award, will I know which man I'm talking about? We got 6 men standing there, and I say to you, the man is my math teacher. Your response is going to be, which man? Well, then I would have to say the one who gave the award. Now that points out which man I'm talking about. So since this adjective clause right here is necessary to identify which one I'm talking about, I don't want to put commas around it, because commas tell me that's garbage. I don't have to have it. But here I've got Mr. Garrett, who is my math teacher, gave the award. So let's just take this out. And then I say, Mr. Garrett gave the award. Do you know who I'm talking about? Of course you do. Whether there's 10 or 15 men, if I say Mr. Garrett gave the award, you know who I'm talking about. Mr. Garrett. I have his name. I do not have to have this information in order to identify who I'm talking about. I've got his name. So basically, this might be interesting information, but it's not part of my basic sentence, and I don't need it, and that's why I can get away with putting commas around it. All right, so basically all of this stuff right here is repeating just what I've said. So when you are looking at this at home, then you can read through that carefully and slowly, and be sure it makes really good sense to you. I've got 2 other sentences right here that you can look at too. Now it's time to see if we can figure out where the commas go in these adjective clauses. So you're going to read the sentence, you're going to identify the clause, and then you're going to ask yourselves these questions. Do I have to have this information in order to identify who I'm talking about? Hopefully you can answer that. It's pretty clear. I've got her name, right? So I really don't need to know this in order to tell who I'm talking about. So let's see how you do on this. This is going to be fun. When you do the answers, you'll see them at the back here. They all are. Go through those. So adjective clauses is a very short exercise, but I really want you to learn to use these. I want you to learn to use them well, and especially learn to punctuate them. It is going to be on the new PSAT. If you are going to be taking the new SAT, which I would not recommend unless you have to, it will be on that. It's already on the ACT. So pay close attention to it, and then we'll move on in just a little bit. I'm going to go on and do the next recording.